There's news. Fox News alert: an unlawful assembly declared in Minneapolis after thousands of anti-ICE protesters hit the streets in response to the fatal shooting of Renee Good.
The situation turning violent, with one group attempting to breach a hotel where they believed ICE agents are staying.
Overnight, violent crashes between federal agents and protesters in Minneapolis after a federal agent shot a man during an immigration operation.
Minnesota is a city on the edge. As protests flare and political rhetoric hits a fever pitch, an old and powerful law is being discussed in Washington, D.C. And it's a law that could authorize American soldiers to be on American streets enforcing American policies. With the state government and the White House on a collision course, you have to ask, how close is Minnesota to the brink of martial law? And what would that even look like? See, what's happening in Minnesota right now is a political and constitutional crisis. It's unfolding in real time. Earlier this week, after all the protests and a couple of shootings, the streets of Minneapolis and St. Paul have become the center of a national firestorm. It all started with this federal operation called Operation Metro Surge, which is an initiative by ICE to carry out widespread deportations. And of course, in Minnesota, this was met with fierce opposition, leading to daily protests, civil unrest, and escalating tension. The situation's become volatile. Right? A man was recently shot in the leg by an ICE officer after he was attacked with a shovel. And this just comes a week after fatal shooting of Renee Good by an ICE agent after she allegedly tried to run him down with her vehicle. Now, the city's mayor, Jacob Frey, has called this an impossible situation for local police to handle.
There's still a lot that we don't know at this time, but what I can tell you for certain is that this is not sustainable. This is an impossible situation that our city is presently being put in. And at the same time, we are trying to find a way forward.
Meanwhile, Minnesota's governor, Tim Walz, is publicly condemning the federal actions, calling it an occupation of his state by federal officers.
Don't take the bait. Do not take the bait. Do not allow them to deploy federal troops into here. Do not allow them to invoke the Insurrection Act. Do not allow them to declare martial law. Do not allow them to lie about the security and the decency of this state.
In response to all of this, the president has issued a direct threat stating he's ready to invoke the Insurrection Act if the local officials don't quell this unrest and stop what he calls an attack on federal agents.
This just happening. President Trump is threatening to send federal troops to Minnesota.
Within just the last hour, the president posted this on Truth Social saying, quote, "If the corrupt politicians in Minnesota don't obey the law and stop the professional agitators and insurrectionists from attacking the patriots of ICE who are only trying to do their job, I will institute the Insurrection Act." Trump goes on to say that, quote, "that would quickly put an end to the travesty that is taking place in that once great state."
So what happens now? Well, we're going to break down this volatile situation on the ground in Minnesota. We're going to look at the extraordinary power known as the Insurrection Act, what it is, where it came from, and how it could be used. And finally, we're going to explore the huge implications of deploying U.S. military on the streets for law enforcement in America, especially against the will of the state's own government. And to understand what might happen next, we have to first understand how powerful and controversial the law is at the center of this storm. To really get to the gravity of the president's threat, we need to unpack two terms that are often interchangeably used, but they mean very different things. The Insurrection Act and martial law. They're not the same thing. Let's start with the one that's being actually threatened by the president, the Insurrection Act. The Insurrection Act is a set of laws that goes all the way back to 1807. Its main job is to be the legal exception to Posse Comitatus Act of 1878. And Posse Comitatus generally forbids the using of U.S. military for domestic law enforcement. That's why you don't see Army soldiers conducting traffic stops or arresting civilians. The Insurrection Act, however, gives the president the power to override Posse Comitatus in specific and extraordinary circumstances. And for what's happening in Minnesota, 3 different parts are critically important. First, there's a straightforward version. This allows the president to send in troops with the state's legislature or its government, formally requesting federal help to put down an insurrection. But that's not happening here. In this version of the act that would require the state's permission, for example, in 1992, the California governor requested federal help to control the riots after the beating of Rodney King. And this was the last time that the Insurrection Act was actually used. But in the situation in Minnesota is different because the governor isn't asking for help. He's actively fighting the federal presence, right? So this brings us to the more controversial parts of the act, the ones that do not require the governor's assistance or a request or the state's consent whatsoever. One key provision that lets the president use the military when he decides that unlawful obstructions, combinations, and assemblages make it impossible to enforce federal law through normal courts. An example would be the normal procedure being that ICE would make their detentions either at the court or at the jails. But that's not happening here due to sanctuary policies of Minnesota. And then there's perhaps the most powerful section of this act. It authorizes the president to deploy troops in response to any insurrection, domestic violence, unlawful combination, or conspiracy that prevents people from exercising their constitutional rights, and state authorities are either unable or unwilling to protect those rights. This section was famously used during the Civil Rights era. Right, President Eisenhower used it in 1957 to send the 101st Airborne into Little Rock, Arkansas to enforce school desegregation efforts, right? And this was against the governor's wishes. So while the Insurrection Act is rarely even used, it's only about 30 times over the 200-year period, right? Its history of being used without state permission does exist. Right. The law also requires that the president issue a formal proclamation, basically a final warning ordering the insurgents that they have a certain amount of time to disperse before he induces the Insurrection Act. So how is this different than martial law? Well, the really important point here is understanding that invoking the Insurrection Act is not the same thing as declaring martial law. Martial law is a far more extreme version of this, okay? It's the temporary takeover of all government functions by the military, right? And it's used usually during a war or a huge crisis. Under true martial law, the military replaces the civilian government completely, right? Civilian courts would be suspended. It's a total substitution of the military for a civilian government. That's not happening here, okay? The Insurrection Act lets the military act as the law enforcement officer body, but it doesn't dissolve the civilian government, okay? So Governor Walz would still be governor, Jacob Frey would still be their mayor, but their law enforcement would be handled by the military, right? It's a step toward militarization, but it's a short step. It's not full military rule or full military control. Okay, so with that legal framework in mind, let's analyze the situation in Minnesota, right? Is the current crisis actually enough to trigger the Insurrection Act? And let's look at the arguments for and against, okay? First, let's build the case for invoking the Insurrection Act. Okay, from the White House's perspective, the president's entire argument would lean on parts of the act that don't need the governor's permission, right? The main justification would be that unlawful obstructions are making it impractical to enforce the laws of the United States. The administration would argue that Operation Metro Surge is the lawful execution of federal immigration laws. The protests, which have involved property damage and clashes with law enforcement, could be framed as unlawful combination designed to stop ICE agents from doing their jobs. The president's already called protesters professional agitators and insurrectionists. And by the shooting of a man who allegedly attacked an ICE officer with a shovel and broom would be Exhibit A. On top of that, the words of Minneapolis's own mayor could be used against him. And Jacob Frey's statement that the city's in an impossible situation could be spun by the federal government as an admission that local authorities can't handle the crisis. He even admits that he only has 600 police officers and can't really handle the job. And this fits right into the language of the act, right? Which applies when state authorities are unable to protect the rights or enforce the laws of the citizens. The White House could also claim that the rights of federal officers to do their jobs are being violated and that Minnesota's leadership is unwilling to protect them. So Governor Walz's statement calling for citizens to record federal agents for future prosecution would be seen by the White House as an incitement against federal authority. Okay, so now let's look at the powerful arguments against using the act. This is the case Minnesota's Attorney General would probably try to make in court. His main argument would be about proportionality. Okay, opponents would argue that while there have been scattered incidents of violence, the protests have been largely peaceful and are protected by the First Amendment. Now, we did an episode on this earlier in the week about protests and the First Amendment and when protests lose their constitutional protections. Okay, there will be links for that down in the box below, so make sure you check that out. I highly recommend that video. Okay, so they'd say that sending in the military is a wildly disproportionate response to civil unrest that hasn't reached the level of a full-blown insurrection. They would point out that local and state governments are still on the job, even if they're strained. And the situation isn't a total breakdown of civilian authority. Now, Governor Walz's position is that the protests are a justified reaction to provocative federal tactics, right? And his argument is that the federal government has created this situation, that the federal government created in the first place. He would argue that invoking the Insurrection Act is just a cynical ploy to use the crisis of an administration's own making as an excuse for an authoritarian power grab. He's already making those claims. He's been claiming that for a while, so basically he would just be sticking to his guns on that. All right, but there's also several big legal hurdles, right? Take a look at the fact that no president has invoked the act against the state's wishes since the civil rights era. That's a long time ago. Doing so would represent a massive escalation of federal power over states' rights. However, it's not unprecedented. There is a history for it. The judge in Minnesota's current lawsuit, while declining to issue an immediate restraining order, called the illegal issues frontier justice and constitutional law, showing just how unsettled all of this kind of case act stuff actually is. But basically, the conflict comes down to federal disagreement over what this crisis actually is. The White House sees it as an insurrection against federal authority. The state sees it as governmental overreach. The language of the Insurrection Act is broad enough that the president could easily find legal justification for this act, but doing so would ignite a constitutional firestorm and it would be written about in history books forever. So what if the president does make that call? What would that actually look like on the streets of Minneapolis? Well, the first step would have to be the formal warning that we talked about. The president's required by law to issue that proclamation ordering all insurgents to disperse and go home within a certain amount of time, right? And this would be a dramatic, highly publicized kind of warning, right? Putting the entire country on notice. It would be probably an executive order or something along those lines. It would be highly nationalized and it would be on TV. You would certainly know. And if the protest continued past that certain deadline, the order to deploy would be given, right? And the president could send in either active duty U.S. military, like the Marines, or he could federalize Minnesota's own National Guard, right? Now, I want to make a quick note here that his social media post warning Minnesota that he could, and he's thinking about doing the Insurrection Act, that does not constitute the actual warning that has to come with this, okay? Federalizing the National Guard, though, is a critical step. It means that he would be taking command of the state's own soldiers away from Governor Walz. He is the commander-in-chief, after all. And he'd be putting them under his direct authority. It would actually send a sharp political message, right? Turning Minnesota's own guard against the will of its state leaders. I mean, how would that look for Governor Tim Walz? Once deployed, these soldiers would be there for law enforcement. We'd see them establish a heavy visible presence in Minneapolis and securing federal buildings like ICE agencies, courthouses, those kind of places. They would set up cordons and checkpoints and handle movement. Imagine the Humvees on the corner, right, at major intersections, and soldiers in combat gear directing traffic and patrolling the streets, right? They could be given the authority to enforce curfews, break up crowds, detain people, right? And if you're shocked at the sight of what ICE is doing, right, the sight of U.S. troops actually making arrests, that would shock you to your soul, okay? So that's something we don't actually want to see happen right here in America, right? We don't need that happening. So Minnesotans need to just settle down, chill out. The last time this happened on a large scale was in 1992 during the Rodney King protest, as I mentioned earlier, right? But in Minneapolis, the mission might be to form a line to protect ICE agents as they conduct raids, or to protect them as they go to make arrests or execute their duties, right? Chances are that's what Trump would do. The potential for escalation would be enormous, though. Clashes between armed soldiers and determined protesters, that'd be inevitable. The psychological impact on the citizens of Minnesota would be immense, and the feeling of being occupied by their own military, right? Of course, they wouldn't actually understand that they brought that on themselves with their own actions, right? See, Governor Walz has already used the word occupation on many occasions to describe the current federal presence, right? The military's arrival would make that actually feel like a tangible, real thing, right? The legal challenges would be immediate, setting up all kinds of high-stakes court battles that the Supreme Court would have to listen to for days, weeks, maybe even years, right? And the question before the court would be monumental, right? Where is the line between a president's duty to enforce federal law and the state's right to govern itself? See, we're at a precarious moment. This situation there in Minneapolis is a tinderbox, right? And it's waiting to burn. On one side, you have the state government, and its people are protesting what they see as a federal campaign in their communities to execute brutality. Governor Walz and Mayor Frey have framed it like that, and they're walking a tightrope, right? Trying to validate that anger while pleading for peace with the president, to avoid the very justification that, they seem to want to try to avoid. On the other side, you have a president who's armed with the Insurrection Act, and it's a powerful tool, and he's not afraid to use it, right? He signaled that he's willing to, and framing protesters as dissenters and actually framing it as a rebellion, he could certainly do those things. This isn't a simple story of right and wrong. It's a story about the tension between state and federal authority that's existed since the country's founding. It's about a line between protest and obstruction, and between keeping the order and military overreach. It's the story of the First Amendment being pushed too far. The situation forces all of us to confront a difficult question. What is the line between enforcement and military action here at home? And who gets to draw that line? Anyway, thanks for listening.